Boa tarde a todos que já estão aqui conosco. O nosso evento vai ser em inglês, vamos falar em inglês, e se tiverem dúvidas podem pôr aqui no bate-papo do Zoom e nós depois vamos, se tiverem questões, e nós depois vamos transmitindo. Obrigada.
Okay, so you're live.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the International Affairs Network Conference with the support of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I am Inês Domingos, President of International Affairs Network, and Willem Hofmeister will say a few words on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation.
Well, thank you very much. Boa tarde, buenas tardes, good evening or good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation to our debate on COVID-19, boom or bust for globalization. It's a great pleasure also to welcome our speakers, Martin-Barbero, who is the Regional Vice Minister of Economy and Competitiveness in the Autonomous Community of Madrid, and João Moreira Rato, the Chairman of Banco CTT and Senior Advisor of Morgan Stanley and Visiting Professor of Universidade Nova in Lisbon. And it's of course a great pleasure for us that we can do another event together with Inês Domingos and the International Affairs Network in Lisbon. So we will discuss today about COVID-19, boom or bust for globalization. I think we do not know yet if it is really boom or bust. Therefore, the discussion will be quite interesting to listen to two experts on that. Nevertheless, we have observed over the last weeks that the globalization as we did know it and experience it over the last years faced serious challenges, and not only in terms of economic problems, of a break of growth and international trade, but also in terms of concepts. When I look to the newspapers and to some speeches and some comments of politicians, so I see that there is much more reverse, or there is much more cautious about the future globalization, which has to do with several aspects, and not at least it is an effect also of the COVID-19 and the behavior of the big shots of the big powers in this context. We have to see that the United States withdraw from the World Health Organization, which is of course one of the pillars of the international system as part of the UN system. We see that the UN system is challenged in several aspects, but now in the peak of the crisis, of health crisis, withdrawing from the World Health Organization, of course, it is a step against the international system as it has developed over the last 75 or so years after the Second World War. On the other hand, we have to see that China is trying to benefit, or it is supposed to, at least some people say, China is trying to benefit from the crisis. And we have seen that China is now the provider of very important goods, and that in Europe, as well as in the United States and in other cases, in other regions, we see that there is some trend to say, okay, we have to continue with our trade and exchange with China, but we also have to provide and to make sure that we are not dependent in a higher grade from China or out of the region forces. And so I see that also within the European Union, for instance, there are some new efforts to concentrate new kind of production and other services and so on within the European Union, so depend less from outside forces. And of course, this is also a step which will affect globalization as it has developed over the last decades. We have to see now next week, the leaders of Europe will hopefully take already definitive decisions on the so-called rescue plan. There will be a lot of money for investment within the European Union, but there are also indications that at least part of the money should be used, will be used, and should be used even to develop industries and services and goods within the borders of the European Union, so depend less from outside forces and international trade. Of course, this is very serious for the European Union, which is the biggest trader on earth. Therefore, I think it's very pertinent to discuss now about COVID-19 and globalization, and I'm very happy that we will now be able to listen to our speakers. Thank you very much, Inês, for this initiative.
Thank you, Willem, and thanks to all who are participating in the Zoom meeting with us and those on Facebook as well. I will like to start by saying that the health and economic crisis has intensified two opposing trends. On the one hand, the use of new technologies increased interaction between people across the globe, and potentially that could help integrate more peripheral regions or countries. And it's, well, the obvious example for us here is that our think tank, based in Lisbon, is holding its second international talk today. So I think that's a sign that there's a promising sign there. On the other hand, there's a political push for self-sufficiency in healthcare and other goods and services that are perceived to be essential, and that is pushing back on globalization. Recently, President Macron and even the Dutch government have argued that Europe needs self-sufficiency in protective gear, and international trade in goods and services is being very much affected. So I would like to first ask our guests, Isaac and João, which trend you think will ultimately win. So Isaac, do you mind starting, please?
Absolutely not. Thank you very much, Inês. Thank you to the Institute of International Affairs and also to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for this opportunity. My understanding is that to a certain extent, what we are going through today, it's just going to be reinforcing some of the trends that we have been coming up in recent years. So, although I'm not sure what is exactly what's going to be happening, if I had to put my bet on one of the two options, which you've asked me to do, I think this is not going to be promoting, this is not going to be boosting globalization. And to a certain extent, it might be the beginning of the end of globalization as we have understood it. And we're going to be seeing different kinds of communities growing worldwide. And to a certain extent, we're going to be witnessing the consolidation of certain divides. So for instance, the fact that we're holding this conference here probably proves that those of us that for our activities rely mainly on knowledge and on technology are going to be receiving a boost in our capacity to do things that we weren't considering before. But at the same time, those of us who were already suffering or were at the short end of the so-called digital divide are going to be seeing that disadvantage aggravated. So I think that although we might be overestimating the short-term impact of the current situation while underestimating the long-term impact, I think that when we look back at this 10 years, 15 years down from now, we will see that certainly the speed of globalization has gone down, even though if we see the emergence of other forms of integration. I think we're going to be seeing less of globalization and more of regionalization, as we had compared to what we had over the past 10 years.
Thank you, Inês. And first, I would like to thank the International Affairs Network for the invitation and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Of course, all the opinions, the usual initial disclaimer that all the opinions are my own and do not convey the opinion of any of the names quoted in my introduction. But the problem of speaking second is that, and mostly when I agree fully with what Isaac says, is that you will repeat more of the same and you will not look very original. But I fully agree with Isaac in the sense that what is happening is reinforcing trends that were already there, I think. And again, if I had to take a guess, I would, and here I'm copying directly from Isaac, I would use the word regionalization, which I think is a good word. Let me explain you a bit why I think that, because when we arrive here, we come from a world where there was a huge boost in trade from the global value chains, you know, from the 90s to the 2007, at least, it was a big growth in global value chains. Global value chains were built where a final product is produced, parts of the product are produced in different locations by different companies, you know, and so when you get a final product, and the big example, of course, that everyone remembers easily is the Apple iPhone, for instance, which is designed in the US, assembled in China, the camera comes from Japan, etc., etc. So these global value chains that were built until the great financial crisis were really, the global financial crisis were really very long and fragmented. So production became long and fragmented. This already, since the crisis, it was being, the tendency was to reduce a bit the size, the dimension, and the fragmentation of this production chain, the global value chain. So this big, and this was because companies were moving production closer to the markets to give them more flexibility in production, because the consumer markets became more volatile. So as consumers quickly disliked the product and wanted a new type of product, again, it would be important for producers to bring production closer to the market so that it's faster to replace. For instance, I can give you an example. Bicycles that are sold in Decathlon, produced in Portugal, because if you go there and you don't like a few characteristics and the bicycle is not working and you need to change it a little bit, it's easier, quicker to do it if you are selling in the Decathlon in Germany, to bring the bicycles from Portugal. So this again is a tendency. It gets you to the trend of reducing the extension and the geographic extension of these global value chains that bring bring about more regionalization of production. And the same trend is reinforced by the fact that there is more automation and robotization of production that makes wages a less important factor when you decide where to produce. So when in that sense, again, the trend was to bring producer closer to the end markets, and so you have seen this tendency. Of course, with the coronavirus crisis, you've seen a huge shock in this global value chains, because this happened in a lot of countries at the same time. So there were lockdowns and closures, and factories had to close in some different remote locations, and this disrupted the production of the final product, and it forced, in a sense, again, the producers to look back into how they were managing this different this global value chains and minimizing the risk of disrupting production. Because if one of the part makers, one of the producers of one of the parts is not there, then you cannot really supply the final product. And you have seen that. I don't know if you had that experience, but I wanted to buy some AirPods or AirPods for my son for his birthday in January, and I couldn't because they were not available at Apple for some time. And I think probably one of the reasons was what was happening in China at the time. So this forces really a lot of management decisions to optimize these global value chains. Another trend that was happening already before was the increase in trade in services. And this is just outright services, but also services included in the production of goods. For instance, the design and marketing that Apple does, a lot of it's value added from services that is incorporated in the Apple phone. So iPhone. So in the iPhone. So the issue here really is there was this trend of increase of incorporation of services in final products, but also of trading services. What we have seen with the coronavirus, and in terms of like the availability and the easiness with which people use technology that allows you to remotely do conferences like this one, it just makes it easier for services to be provided remotely. So people are talking about are having their first therapy sessions remotely. There are some visits to the doctors that are starting to happen remotely, and people before the coronavirus would not think about doing this remotely. And now they are thinking, okay, it's a possibility. Again, the provision of educational services remotely, it's something that is happening. So all of this accelerates a trend that was already happening before, which was the capacity that was out there to do part of the provision of services in a remote way. It's now being accelerated by this process of the coronavirus, because people became more comfortable with the technologies that allow it to do it. So in a sense, that's my justification to agreeing with what Isaac just said before myself.
Well done. I was what you both said actually made me raise an issue which I think is interesting, raise an important issue. If we are going to see a trend towards regionalization, I think probably there is going to be one thing that globalization did was to bring towards to integrate in global trade regions that had been set apart. And so as a result, world poverty fell quite dramatically over the last 40 years. It is quite extraordinary. There was the fall that the World Bank reports. Nowadays, they're less than 10% of the population with absolute poverty, and that is a trend that I fear might go into reverse. So perhaps we'll feel more comfortable, but do we not think it's a net loss for society if we have to go back to the 80s, where you had to do concerts to help people because there was famine in so many places? João, would you like to start?
Yes, no, I think the risk, of course, here is as cheap labor, in a sense, it becomes less important part of choices of production, that there will be less opportunities for countries to catch up, for the poorest countries in the world to catch up to the middle income countries. I think the biggest opportunity probably, and you're right here, is for middle income countries that can benefit of this provision of services, because they can maybe provision services a bit in a cheaper way. They have the human capital to do it there, and at the same time they can attract young professionals. And so I think I agree with you. I think the biggest opportunity probably is for the middle income countries, and the fact that will be less labor incorporated into goods production can make it more difficult for low income countries to catch up, and to repeat a phenomena that like you have seen in China since between 2000 and 2010, 2015.
Well, actually, in Spain, Spain and Portugal have a similar have had a similar experience recently with the crisis. So the next question I'd like to ask, perhaps to Isaac first, is: do you feel that we experienced quite severe recession in 2011 up to 2013? And I was wondering if you thought that we are better prepared for this one, given particularly in our countries that depends so much on exports. At the time, exports compensated somewhat for the decline in domestic demand, which resulted from the adjustment. But now everyone is pretty much in a similar situation. So do you think that we have a chance to recover, or will it? At the beginning, I think most people were hoping for a sort of V-shaped or a quite fast recovery. And nowadays, everyone is more concerned, not only because of the disease, but also because recovering from a crisis that affects the whole world takes time. There's nothing to support. I mean, no country is able to support anyone else. So, so how do you think we'll fare in Europe and Iberia in particular?
Well, if may I, you are the moderator, sure. But may I ask permissions just to address very briefly?
Of course, yes.
Short answer: yes, there is a net loss for sure, but I think that today, well, a small detail to that. You're absolutely right. There was a tremendous reduction in absolute poverty. Although I think that we need to bear in mind the fact that that was extremely concentrated in just two countries, which are the home of a very significant amount of the world's population, India and China, in that sense. And I think that although that's the case, we are now entering an era where we might be more interested in distribution than we are in growth. And basically, we might not be so concerned about the fact that we are losing net world growth, as somehow going back to Joao's reasoning, the fact that probably we were growing, some people think that we were growing too much at the expense of those that were less well off in our own countries. So that if the world grows a little bit more slowly and there's a little bit more that stays within our borders, many people would be very happy with that outcome. Okay, so that's my short answer for the previous question. And then on this second one, well, it depends very much on what we do. I am no expert on Portugal, so allow me to skip that part. But as from our experience in Spain, I think that the previous crisis worked tremendous change in our country. Traditionally, our companies were mainly exporting only when the domestic market was collapsing. The last recession before this one was so phenomenal that they needed to readjust the mindset completely, that many companies disappeared, many others started from scratch. So when the domestic market recovered, they didn't readjust their focus. And that has changed completely the attitude of most Spanish companies towards internationalization. I mean, we paid a very dear cost, but we came out as a more competitive market from the previous crisis. What about this one? Well, I think that the challenge in this crisis is succeeding at riding the digital wave. Again, I don't know for Portugal, but in Spain, we have great infrastructures in that domain. But the truth is that our businesses are not at the level, I mean, generally speaking, and particularly the SMEs, are not at the level that they need to be if they really want to take that hard-earned competitive advantages to the next level. So how we come out of this crisis will very much depend on that. That said, again, as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, not everything can be digitalized. So I think that again, and going back to the fact that distribution is very much at the top of the current agenda, also domestically, we will need both to succeed setting the right policies to take the best possible advantage of the current situation country-wise, but we will also need to make sure that we find ways by which the winners of that transformation can compensate or at least help the losers or at least the laggers in that transformation to catch up with them.
João, what do you think? You have a big experience in the Portuguese recovery. You were living right through that and helping a bit through that recovery. So in Portugal, so how do you feel we're prepared for this one?
No, I think one of the things that I learned and I try to communicate to the investor community when I was in that job that you mentioned, when I was you know, in the Portuguese debt management office and contacting with investors, is that the Portuguese economy is more resilient than people think. So it's more diversified, at least people thought at the time, you know, and that was a bit of our message at the time. So because, you know, exports are quite diversified, tourism played a role at the time, but at the time didn't really play so much of a role. The growth of tourism came mostly, a lot of it afterwards, but it was already played a role, but not as big as it plays now. So really the shock here for the economy will come from the tourism. There will be a bit of issues on the exporting side because you do auto parts, for instance, and where you are integrated in the production of actually a lot of it is German autos, but also French autos, and I think Spain the same, and this will suffer a little bit, but I believe the economy is diversified, and there is another positive at this stage, which is the issue that Portugal is better placed than at the time of that crisis to be a very interesting location to provide services to the outside world. So you could, and you see it already. You will be Lisbon, Porto could be a good base to supply services to the outside world. And I think again the communications technology is good. The airport works. There are good connections. The roads are good. So you have the infrastructure. And then you of course Portugal and Spain offer the advantages of what people, it doesn't sound good, but what people call good lifestyle, because the climate is good. There's a lot of things you can do, and so I think cities in the Iberian Peninsula, not only in Portugal, can play an important role in attracting some of these service providers, high-value service providers that are a bit more nomad that they used to be, that are providing digital services to the outside world, and get them to live and base here. So you have to see every crisis a little bit as an opportunity, you know, and the previous crisis offered a lot of opportunities for the exports. Like Isaac said, it was a very similar story in Portugal for the export industry in Portugal to catch up with the rest of the world and to become more competitive, and the exports as a percentage of GDP grew. This one could be could provide a good opportunity in terms of location for service providers. That it's a trend that you are already seeing, but it could strengthen that trend, and you can see that happening. Of course, the economy will suffer through a loss of tourism, a bit of a loss of exports, but I believe the economy is resilient, and there are a lot of there will be a lot of there will be a lot of support too from the stage through this stage, but I don't think you will probably need it for too long.
Okay, well, that's a positive view, so that's that's great. You said something that I thought was really interesting, Isaac and João, two different things. First, talking a bit about countries that might actually benefit from this regionalization or from a change, actually, because a lot of globalization, I think you're right, was done on the back of integrating countries and regions, but also a lot on the back of China, which is a big player and a big winner of globalization. And now that there seems to be some pushback against China because of the way it dealt with the virus, some regions will benefit. And I think particularly India might become a big winner in this in this new world. So do you think there's a chance for other countries, and which countries and regions do you think will become more preeminent? And I think actually the ultimate question as well is whether finally regions like Africa will be able to take advantage somehow of this and maybe better integrated into world trade and perhaps benefit more than they have so far of internationalization.
Well, I think that distance is going to play a larger role, as João very well explained in his first answer. So I think we're going to be moving away from a logic of cutting costs to a logic of remaining relatively close to the customer, just in case value chains break down. But I think that at the same time, in the same way as China somehow has suffered in its reputation regarding the managing of this crisis, even if we do have a mixed picture on that, because it depends who you ask. For some people, they've shown to be very effective and very capable. Another thing is how transparent have they been when it comes to managing the information. But again, they might not be so alone in that domain. I think that what's coming up to a certain extent is a revision of the whole concept of how things work out. I mean, I can't help but recall that in 1989, I turned 18. And 1989, so as you'll see, I'm very much a child of my time, was a time where we thought that the end of history was close. And there was this clear logic: market economy, middle class, democracy. A few years back, we came to realize that that equation didn't exactly always play out as expected. And probably the big country that was proving that equation not to be a precise one was China. So I think that there is a mixture of different factors, and we are all somehow closing, inward. And the one reason why we're not going back to pure nationalism, it's probably because it's not workable. Because we are at a point where we are so integrated that that's literally not feasible. So what's the next level? Well, the next level is regionalization. And there in the EU, we have a world exception, which is a very strong union, very deep union, very far-reaching union, which is also to a very large extent based on shared values to a large extent, and depending on the members. That happens also when you get to be very diverse. But to me, what's going to happen is that we're going to be organizing ourselves somehow in circles of proximity, and not, geographically, but also in terms of value. So probably, although the great answer could be to say that this might be Africa's great opportunity, I think that it might be a very different story if we're talking about Northern Africa, or talking about sub-Saharan Africa, where, by the way, China, it's extremely present once again. So again, I think that we're going to see things becoming a bit more simple, and we're going to see a decrease in the willingness of companies to venture into territories where they just don't feel comfortable because they are too far away or too foreign to the political and legal systems that they're used to operating in.
Okay, that's very good points. Another question I wanted to ask, and I think that's important for Portugal and Spain, is about tourism. Of course, in Portugal and Spain, tourism is very big. Employment in Spain before the pandemic was 13% of total employment, and in Portugal the latest data we have is close to 10% of total employment, but it was probably higher than that in 2019. So in 2016 there were respectively Spain and Portugal the second and sixth most dependent countries of the OECD in terms of tourism employment. Now, with this recession hitting on particular sectors and with particular severity on tourism, how will we be able to get back from this? Will we benefit perhaps more from that regionalization you were talking about, whereby Europeans stay within Europe and we'll just shift, the flows will just shift, or is it a net loss, at least for a couple of years, 2 to 3 years, while this thing gets sorted out? João, perhaps you'd like to answer this one first?
Yes, of course. Besides being in agreement with Isaac, it's good to see that we have exactly the same age too. So you know, I was 18 in '89 too. So no, but I think the issue there is a bit what Isaac connects with what Isaac was saying, which is the issue of what you do to the most low-skilled part of your population, because inside our countries you have higher skills, medium, average skills, and you have lower skills, and tourism has created a lot of jobs, I think, in the lowest skilled part of the population. And so this will be a problem in the next 2 years. Maybe it depends on how long this pandemic stays with us, the COVID-19 stays with us. But depending on that, you'll have probably to give some level of social support during this period to this part of the population, and you have to be careful that they are looked for, because they tend to be the lowest skilled, and some of them are employed in the more informal way. So you have to make, that's the biggest worry, I think, from this period that we are going through, you know, in terms of the tourism. I think after this issue disappears, tourism probably, I don't see why tourism would not come back. But in the meantime, a lot of these people will be a bit left behind, and you have to be careful that that doesn't create a big social picture, because the most time these people these people that are unemployed, lower skilled people that are unemployed, stayed unemployed, the most difficult is for them to come back to the job market. And so, social policies have to be, during this period, have to be very much targeted to this part of the population. Regarding what Isaac said regarding Africa, I fully agree. I think North Africa has an opportunity to in this production reorganization, where production gets closer to the market, because they are relatively close to the European, Central European markets and the European market, consumer market. I think sub-Saharan Africa is another story, and it could continue to be a story of commodities, resources, and and I think probably it will be more an issue for external policy and external support on the part of Europe than because in the logic of what we have been saying, it doesn't seem to be going to be easy for them to catch up to middle income economies, income levels.
And Isaac, would you have some comments on that?
My comment is that it's very brief. I agree completely with my 1971 colleague.
Well, then I'm going to open the floor for questions. For those who are participating, if you want to add a question, I suggest that you use the the chat here on Zoom. And as people gather courage to do that, I will ask one final question. I think what João was saying, that there will be a lot of support, brings another issue, of course, which is the global rise in debt. For our countries, that's very significant. We have very high levels of debt, but it is already a very leveraged world, and it will become more so. So which types of risk do you think come from that? And do you think that those risks are fully mitigated by actions by central banks at the moment? For instance, the ECB and the Fed and most central banks of advanced economies are buying everything. So basically, so far there's no risk, but do you see that in the future that will be an issue to be dealt with? Perhaps this time Isaac could start.
Okay, thank you. It's very challenging to answer this question before the former person who was responsible for debt management in Portugal. But anyhow, I think we currently finding security in liquidity. So it's quite complicated to answer applying the logic of orthodox economic theory. Having said that, I think that it certainly poses big questions regarding the future. But in order to reach the future, you first need to get through the current situation. So the one comparison that comes to mind when we look at the situation is a war. And we've seen similar and even higher levels of debt in other countries after wars. And provided that you reach the rates of growth required, and provided that you can see sometime in the future inflation coming back, I mean, I'm not talking about horrendous two-digit inflation, but I mean some kind of inflation, because I mean the current situation also is extremely puzzling. I think that that is manageable. Having said that, it's hard to find a way in which we can keep indefinitely spending more than we get through taxes. I mean, the mechanisms by which debt is reduced are pretty well established, and unless we generate tremendous growth, none of the alternatives it's very palatable, because for instance, increasing taxes dramatically, it's also going to have very significant effects on the growth prospects of the country. And I don't know about Portugal, again, excuse my ignorance, but in Spain, I do not see room for dramatic reductions in expenditure. And far to the contrary, I see in the short term, again, as João said, that very relevant increases will have to be accepted if we are to avoid extremely dismal scenarios.
Okay. João, would you like to add something?
Yes, no, I agree with all that Isaac said, and the issue here that you have to always be conscious is, of course, that one of the reasons to take on debt is to smooth consumption across time. So it allows you to deal with periods like wars or pandemics, and then pay it back in better years. But one thing we have to avoid this illusion that there is a bit in some places nowadays that you don't pay back debt. You know that there will you can pay back in different ways, but you'll have to pay it back. You know, if you bring inflation on, there is inflation tax. If you keep interest rates too low for too long, it's a tax on savings. So in 30 years from now, when you retire, if you look at the compounded effect of such low rates on your savings, it's quite big. So and so you will pay for it. So I think there is in some circles nowadays the tendency to convey the idea that you won't have to pay for debt, that resources are limited, and it's just monetary policy solves everything, like washes away the debt easily, and it's not. It's not the case. So I think it's like Isaac said, that it makes sense at this stage to engage, to increase that, because if you don't do it in periods like this, you know, it seems that it tells you that the system is not working. But at the same time, you have to be careful to try to understand that you are going to have to pay for it, and there is some type of acceptance of the instrument that you are going to use to pay for it. I think that's very important, and of course, this central bank policy of low rates and balance sheets, very big balance sheets, where they have a lot of the government debts of the countries. It's very difficult to revert, because when you revert it, asset prices normally suffer, and there will be a reaction to it from people that hold a lot of assets. So in that sense, these policies of central banks are difficult to revert, and you have to be careful not to fall into a trap where you are at very low rates for a very, very, very long time, and where central banks increase their balance sheets a lot and they cannot really decrease them in the future.
Okay, so is there anyone who'd like to ask a question to our guests today?
There are questions in the chat, Inês.
Yes, we do. We have a couple. So let me start. Dr. José Veiga Sarmento asks, what will be the role for Europe to cope with the member states' difficulties? And João Ferreira asks whether what will happen to economic growth and NPLs in smaller countries? What your opinions are on those two questions? So who would like to start?
Okay, I can start now. I think regarding member state difficulties, I think Europe has put in place a lot of new instruments that will allow the different members to deal with some of these issues, you know, from the shore, the reconstruction fund, all these mechanisms, new mechanisms that are in place are quite, I think, are quite powerful and show really how Europe shows solidarity in moments like this. You know, again, regarding we cannot forget that the last crisis that we had in our countries, we had the support of our European partners in terms of funding during that time. That was very important to smoothen the adjustment. Regarding the NPLs in smaller countries, I think the issue of the NPLs right now, it's not only an issue of smaller countries, it's a pan-European issue. You know, there will be some companies in specific sectors that we have been talking about that will be particularly hurt and will be in a situation where they may become insolvent. And this exposure to this, it's spread all over Europe. I don't think it's a specific problem of smaller countries at this stage.
Okay.
May I?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I also would like to stress the fact that at least for Spain, the previous crisis, the assistance of the European Union was of paramount importance. I'm not so sure, although, and this is a question, it's not a statement, whether regardless of the size of the packages, we already have the kind of instruments that we require to deal with the current crisis. I think that it's fair to acknowledge the fact that it's a crisis which is not only huge, but which arrived without warning, literally. And I think it can be excused that we have not yet come up with the best instruments to respond to it. Because it's not just about, again, the money, it's how do we introduce money into the system. And that leads me to the second part of the question. By the way, I would like to thank the audience who asked us this. It goes back to the non-performing loans. The governor of the Bank of Spain said a couple of days ago, when he was being asked on whether banks should be somehow relaxing the requirements for the loans so as to help the companies to deal with the current situation. And he said something which to me surprisingly hasn't been more or at least as discussed as it should have been. He said, if we want to support companies through these bad times, maybe we should go for outright subsidies. What we absolutely must avoid is to erode the solvency of the financial system. So that's something which was very much in mind of our in the mind of our partners in the European Union, which were the first to come up with these public guarantee schemes. But I think that we are somehow, or we might somehow be overlooking the fact that once there is a non-payment, the fact that there is a public guarantee to back that non-payment doesn't mean that the institution that had that credit comes out of it completely clean. And not just because there's a coverage of 80% or 90%, because at times there is even 100% in some of the countries. So I think we should be very careful with that. And absolutely, yes, and thank you, João, also for pointing that out. The non-performing loan issue, has nothing to do with countries being small or big or the economy. It has to do with the companies. I mean, we can have the strongest country, the strongest company, and if it deals in trouble, it's going to be through deep trouble in current times. So I think that we must acknowledge that obviously, the weaker the country, the weaker the economy, and the smaller the company, yes, difficulties do compound, but non-performing loans is absolutely not an issue which is just limited to small countries at all.
Yeah, Isaac, if I may, I was the one posing the question on the non-performing loans. My question is, or was, let's put it this way, is and why smaller countries? You know, in my view, we're going to eat, you know, I'm not going to be as dramatic as saying that we're going to eat a tsunami of NPLs, but yes, we're going to face an increase of them, particularly on companies with all these moratoriums, et cetera. And I do think that we're going to have a bit of a problem because in certain companies and given the relationship that certain banks in certain countries have with their NPLs, which is they prefer to delay the problem, we may have these NPLs in companies that are important for the economy sitting in the worst possible place, which is the balance sheet of banks that prefer to delay the problem because they don't have capital to bite the bullet. Let's put it this way. And why my point about small countries? I think we're going to need capital that's going to come in certain instruments coming from, you know, the EU, et cetera, but we're going to need smart money as well. We are seeing a lot of private equities raising capital to take on opportunities in European corporates, but they're going to focus where? France, Spain, Italy, Germany. Right? It's, you ask any big private equity if they are interested in investing in, say, Portuguese companies. You know, we have a stock exchange which is called PSI 20, which doesn't have 20 companies. Right? This is where I wanted to go to. This type of new NPLs, not NPLs in general, I think are going to be a bigger problem for smaller countries because you don't going to have all the smart money. You may have some money through it, but not the smart money, number one. And number two, the Portuguese banks, for example, may not have the capacity to bite the bullets and be proactive and allowing new money coming in and assuming restructures, etc. Sorry for the long, question.
May I, Inês?
Yeah, sure. Please do.
Well, thank you, João, for the question and for giving me the opportunity both to understand better the question and maybe to clarify my answer slightly. And thank you also for raising an extremely important thing, which is the need for capital. I mean, which it's not, what we have seen, generally speaking, and which is a big change from traditional EU rules. I mean, we are moving, from a situation where a company cannot receive, must receive less than 300,000 euros, according to the minimis regulation through a number of years. I mean, where state aids are extremely controlled, to another situation where we are seeing massive requirements and open requirements of capital injections in huge companies. So I see your point, but let me rephrase what I should have said. Let me put it this way: that problem is not going to be limited to small countries. There are big countries with big companies that are going to have that problem as well, and that problem has to do very much with the institutional arrangement by which companies are being supported. Let me give you an example. In France, state guarantees are given for a longer period than in Spain. And that makes a huge difference because that affects the size of the repayments, it affects the time in which you can recover. And by no means, I don't want to criticize neither France nor what we've done here. What I'm saying is that we're seeing a situation where we are actively seeing lots of public intervention into the economy, which theoretically, and I would say in practical terms, goes directly against everything that we said that we stood for in the single market. And the paradox of that is that we're doing that in order to save the single market. So we're going to have to live with quite a few contradictions in the coming years in order to navigate the current crisis. And yes, the weaker you are, the more concentrated you are in sectors and companies and regions or areas that are suffering, the worse it's going to be. But still, the best companies in the best places with the largest economies cannot see themselves out of the woods at all. That's what I meant, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify that.
Cool. Thank you.
If I may, Inês.
Okay. Yeah, João, se calhar podes... Isso mesmo.
Yes, I would like to just outline something very important. I think that Isaac said that it's a bit what I was saying too about the role of the central bank, which exactly we are in a very contradictory situation, when we are trying, when Isaac gave the example, trying to save the single market and adding a risk to it by saving it. So we are in a situation where looks a bit like a contradiction, and the central bank is the same thing. You cannot question that it's important to bring liquidity into the table, but it's, of course, if you by the way you do it, as some risks attached to it. And the other one that I wanted to add is by in this period protecting your companies and making sure that they are alive when the COVID-19 situation disappears, and you keep them alive. At the same time, you are doing something that is dangerous too, in some sense, which is trying to freeze the economy. And the economy is something dynamic, where some companies will have to go insolvent, some others will have to be created, and by freezing the economy, you take some risks, and some of the risks that you are talking about, which is this issue of the zombie that people talk about, which is the zombie companies, which is keeping companies alive with these types of support and the restructuring loans and everything that in reality should be acquired by some other company or should be insolvent and sold their capital to someone else, etc. So we are a bit in a contradictory situation where we could to sort out in the short term this situation. We are taking risks that we will have to deal with later on, and that we should be conscious of. And that's a bit I think it's a bit the contradictions that Isaac was mentioning when he was saying that by wanting to save the single market, you are taking some risks that are challenges to the single market itself.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a few more questions. So Hugo Moreira has sent a question here on the chat, and he says, do you think the bust of globalization will increase, decrease, or have no effect in income inequality in the European society? I will add to this one, there's another question, a slightly different one from Tiago Cavaco Alves, and he asks, thinking about Iberia and the new regionalization trend that you're seeing, what are the new industries and technologies that you both think that we should focus apart from our traditional ones, and industries where we could have a competitive advantage against other EU countries? So so those two questions. If I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, maybe I've been taking a lot of time. Maybe João.
Yes, I can. Okay, I think, like I said before, this shock is going to be very unequal in some sense. It will affect more poor parts of the population than the richer part of the population. So in that sense, in terms of this shock will probably affect the way income distribution is going to the income distribution in the next few years. So that's something that you should keep in the back of your mind, because socially you have to do something about it, and that's something I think you should tackle. The second, I can give an example. For instance, the auto industry, it's in the middle of a process of retransformation. The European auto industry has been very competitive worldwide, and it's a very where the production process takes place all over Europe. You know, the branding, the marketing, the design, the engineering, a lot of it, some France, Germany, Spain, some of the auto parts are done in Portugal and in Spain again, and in other countries in Eastern Europe. So it's really an industry that has a production process spread all over Europe. And it's in the process of transformation, in a sense, because there is this challenge of becoming competitive in terms of electric cars and produce cars with less emissions, which is really a challenge. And it's an industry that is very spread out all over Europe. So this is a good example of a regionalized, I think, regionalized industry. That will have a few challenging years, and it's really different regions of Europe will play a part on this retransformation.
If I may, very shortly, I'm not sure whether this slowing of the globalization pace is going to bring more or less inequality. What I'm afraid is that this current crisis is going to bring more inequality because of the digital divide that I mentioned before. I think that we're going to see bigger differences in work opportunities between people that can develop their activities in a digital way. We're going to see bigger differences in terms of education. Personally, that's something that worries me a lot. I mean, this is creating tremendous differences between those kids that can stay connected and follow their studies vis-a-vis those others that are basically left to fend for themselves, and even in the way that we live. So I think that we also need to start thinking inequality in a different way. And there's a very brief note. I mean, systematically, when we're talking about inequality, we're thinking in terms of wealth. And this crisis has proven that inequality, and to a certain, inequality is much more relevant in Europe these days in terms of exposure to risks. And I don't mean to COVID. I mean people who are one divorce, one disease, or one firing away from losing their spot in society. Vis-a-vis those others that can afford those things to happen without threatening them. And even more so, those that can take chances in different investments, can take risks that others can't take risks. So to me, that's the largest inequality. And I hope that this crisis brings that forward. And I think that that's going to be, it's a great opportunity to rethink what the state safety nets are really ought to be about in the 21st century. And talking about the industries, just a few ideas. I think that, frankly speaking, and allow me here to be very blunt, this crisis has forced the Spanish central government to rethink its relationship with the automotive industry. It has finally apparently come to understand that in order to promote greener automotive landscape in Spain, you don't need to give up on the types of vehicles that are actually manufactured here, that you can't afford to do that because that's 10% of your GDP. So that if you want to work against climate change, if you want to promote greener development, you need to do that in a non-radical, technologically biased way. So that's a great opportunity. I don't know about the state of the automotive industry in Portugal, but in Spain, that's a key change. I think we can move forward in knowledge industries. Again, there we can take the digital advantage, embrace it fully. And there in tourism, I think we ought to be duly concerned about what's going to be happening in the tourism sector in the coming future. But at the same time, I think that these might bring an end, or at least a strong stop to the dematerialization of the tourism industry. I think that we are going to be having a very interesting combination for some time. Traveling is going to be reduced, so probably we're going to have more opportunities of traveling among areas with similar sanitary conditions, and that's going to increase the amount of people staying both in Portugal and Spain, spending their time. That's going to increase the willingness of European visitors to stay within 2 European locations. And at the same time, for countries that have invested heavily in traditional tourism infrastructure, it's an opportunity to upgrade that infrastructure. It's an opportunity to make more clearly understood what a difference it makes to go to know what is it that you're going to find once you reach a certain location. And I really believe that paradoxically, again, and this is it seems to be a very paradoxical time, it's a great opportunity for both Portugal and I dare say include Portugal, even if I don't know it that well, but I know it well enough to dare to say so, and Spain in the tourism sector.
Thank you. We have one last question from Jaime Casado. Jaime?
Yes, I'd like to make a question to my dear friend João. How are you, João? I don't speak with you for a long time. I think the question is very simple. I read an article from Jean-Pierre Pisani in Bruegel, a very well-known think tank in Brussels, about the way that now, in this complex time we are living, the financial markets really reflect the competitiveness of our economy. Concerning Portugal, for instance, we have a very interesting challenge in terms of our industry and our tourism. How do you think that it will be possible in the future to have a better connection between the idea that the financial market have of our competitiveness and the effectiveness of this competitiveness? I don't know if you understood the question.
Yes, you are asking. I think you are asking a question too about like that is linked to the growth of productivity, or the lack of growth of productivity, or that the productivity growth in Portugal should be higher. Yes, no, I think that this is a good time to think about a lot of these different things. You know, why, for instance, one it goes back for instance to this issue of regionalization. You can see that you can clearly see from the data in Portugal that the companies that are integrated in global value chains, that are bigger, that are exporting, and a lot of them that are linked to multinationals, have a higher productivity than very similar firms doing similar things, but they are smaller, they are not exporting. And that shows you the importance of being interconnected, and benefiting from these interlinkages to increase productivity. So I think besides all the other things that you say usually about what you should do for productivity growth, I think if the economy, the Portuguese economy, continues to increase its connections in different global value, you call it European value chains in this case, it's only going to benefit from that. So I always thought the more the Portuguese economy will be integrated within Europe and within the Europe production process, the better it is. The same is valid for the cities. You know, the more people you attract from all over the place that are doing the same type of activities, and you get to a critical mass where people want to relocate to these cities, the more productive these cities will be too, in terms of service, provision and exporting of services, the kind of trends that we were talking about before. So all this are very important, and Portugal only has to gain, to open up more, to integrate more within the European production process, either in manufacturing or services. And I think this is very important. Of course, in all our countries, there is always a resistance, a local resistance to opening up and to integrate within within the European area or whatever, or any other area outside of the country. But it's very important that this continues, you know, that you because that's the, I think that will make only companies in manufacturing sector more productive, your service is more productive, and it's going to be better. And you have seen already that in tourism in the last few years, for instance.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you to we'll wrap it up here. We've had quite an interesting discussion. Thanks to our guests for participating in this, and thanks for all that participated in the discussion and asked questions both here in this meeting and saw us on Facebook. So thank you everyone, and well, we'll keep discussing all these issues, I'm sure, in the next few weeks and months. So thank you and bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.